Jonathan, do you want to know what designers have nightmares about?
Yes.
Designers have nightmares about this phrase. This looks great. Let me just get the board's input.
Ooh, I'm already recoiling.
So this episode is going to be about how to get community input on whatever big project you're doing, whether that's a rebrand or a website project or a marketing project or a new program or a strategic plan, any kind of big project where there's probably a good argument to be made to get community input. How do you do that without getting derailed? How do you do that without watering down the results and just trying to kind of please everyone? And at the end, you just end up with this kind of watered down, weak, sad version of what you imagined at the beginning. And I've experienced this many times in many different ways in kind of all shapes and sizes over the years with rebrands and website projects and the kind of work that we do at Cosmic. And I've seen all these different approaches that our clients take to try to get community input or to try to hide these projects from their community or some stakeholders because they're afraid of the input that they're going to get. And I've really kind of come around to including more of the right people at the right time being the right strategy. And we'll unpack this a lot more in today's episode, but I know you've experienced this in all shapes and sizes as well, so I think this one should be fun.
Oh, baby. Let's go.
I'm Eric Ressler.
I'm Jonathan Hicken.
And this is Designing Tomorrow. So let's assume you as a social impact marketer or leader are about to embark on some kind of big project, a project that matters, a project that is going to be unavoidable to roll out and something that you can't just kind of do behind the scenes. But you're afraid, right? Because you're afraid to get community input because you know that this can be somewhat painful. Now, I know you've been on both sides of this before. I have a bunch of ideas around how you might do this better, largely learning painfully around how to not do this well. And I'm just curious, has this been something that's come up for you?
Every single day, I think about when and how to gather feedback from the community that we serve constantly. And I've experimented with a lot of different approaches, extremely inclusive and open to much more closed. And I have failed on both sides of that spectrum. So I am delighted that we're going to unpack this together.
So I think you bring up immediately a pretty good point, which is that there's not one way to do this, and there's maybe not one way you should do this, that you might need to kind of right-size this or have different approaches for different types of projects. Sometimes you got to just do stuff, right? And you got to just make choices and live with the consequences of those choices. And other times, that's a very big, risky thing to do without getting community input. And if you do it without community input, it might come back around to bite you in the butt.
I've got some tips. I am chomping at the bit to start throwing at you immediately, but I'm going to hold off and see where you're coming from and then add a little color to it.
My first idea, and this is actually, I think if you just did this part right, all the rest of it would probably go a little bit better. Be clear to yourself and to your community about how much input and influence they will have in the decision-making process.
Yes. And to bring that even with a little bit more detail, I would say, how are you going to use the input to make decisions? And linking, when you give me your feedback about this, I'm going to use that information to make this decision, and I will be the one making the decision here. Or, and on the other case, maybe it's, we're going to be taking a vote here, and you all are going to decide. But in either case, understanding for yourself and for the people you're speaking with and engaging with, how decisions are being made and how their input is influencing those decisions.
Yeah, and I really think that this, if done well, can solve so many of the other issues that we see. Because what I've seen happen is if people feel like they are sidestepped or they feel like their input wasn't heard or wasn't acted on, that could be even worse than just not even asking them, right? So if you are going to ask people for feedback, be really clear about what kind of feedback you're looking for and how that feedback will actually be used and how much influence they're going to have. And that way, if people have a problem with that, you can just say, well, thank you. I guess this isn't going to be a fit. and there's a respectful transaction that's happened there. Because really, I think a lot of this comes down to just like expectation setting. The other thing that I think is huge here is when. When do you get input from the community? And we've made every mistake you could possibly make here in our work, probably. And what I've learned over the years is that you need input for any big project kind of in multiple parts of the project. I like to get input at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. And what I've learned is if you only get input at the beginning, but not in the middle or the end, people can or will feel kind of sidestepped or like they're not clear around how their input was actually enacted or not. If you only get input at the end, it's probably too late to do anything with that input. And if you get input at the beginning and the end, there's just a little too much has happened between those two pieces of feedback. And again, it's kind of risky. You might be going back to the drawing board. So I think about this in the sense of like getting feedback from the board or any like big decision-making stakeholders, which for some organizations might be the community of supporters, right? If you're doing more of a kind of co-creation, community-led model. And so we'd like to get input and data and insights and hear voices early on. That is gold for us as creatives and as designers, because that gives us ideas. It gives us insight. It helps guide our strategy. It gives us some stuff to start to work with. And it's not to say that we're going to take that community input and just figure out how to like, copy paste it into a rebrand or a website project. Like we still need to be strategic with that input, and we need to interpret that input, and we need that to be a set of data that we use along other data sets to influence our decision making. But we like to have input beginning, middle, end, obviously a high level benchmark, but yeah, curious about timing and when input should happen.
For me, timing has more to do with my ability to reflect back to the people I'm collaborating with the results of their input. Anytime I'm going to collect feedback, I want to be able to credibly promise that I'm going to show them how they've made a difference here. And if I can't credibly commit to that ability to reflect their influence, then for me, I'm probably not going to take the step towards including them in the first place. So for me, it's more of this a matter of reaction and this interplay with the audience and our ability to show how the impact that they're having, as opposed to necessarily like beginning, middle, end. What I will say is that there's this idea of like convergent thinking and divergent thinking, right? And in creative processes, you probably do this all the time, right? You start with a divergent process. You try to gather as many ideas as you can, and then you synthesize those, and you work it back down to a smaller decision point. I have found that community input can work in both the divergent thinking phase and the convergent thinking phase. Just the nature of the input that people are giving is different. The kinds of decisions that come after that input is different, and it's important to reflect all of those components and all of those variables back to the community that's giving you the input in the first place.
Right. And you don't want convergent feedback in the divergent phase or divergent feedback in the convergent phase.
That's right. And to your first point, that's where setting expectations with your collaborators is critical to making this work.
Another element that I think is really important when it comes to getting community input or community feedback is how you ask for that feedback. That might be the format. Like, is it a survey or is it a focus group or interview? Is it some kind of like open session? Like, there's so many ways to get input. I think the first thing that comes to mind to me is like these city council meetings where people are up there giving their speeches and you can just like see the city council like rolling their eyes. Is that a constructive way to get input and feedback? I don't know. Like, we don't need to debate that right now. But how you ask can almost be more important than who you ask. Obviously, both are important as well. But to me, it's about, are you designing the right structures and the right processes for gathering feedback so that people feel comfortable, empowered, and can show up and be as valuable as possible as a community person giving feedback on your decision?
I think that starts with the decision maker on the inside having a really clear understanding of the kinds of decisions that they're going to need to make along the way and the kinds of information that they're going to need in order to make the best informed decisions. And so that's an argument right there for really planning out your community collaboration points for a big initiative, say like a major strategic plan or a rebrand or something, is that you kind of know ahead of time what the process looks like and where you're going to get that community input and what kind of information you need at each stage to make good decisions.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it is going to be the directional kind of feedback where you just need to get the sense that you're on the right track. Other times, maybe you need a large enough sample size to make a case to make a decision somewhere. You need to demonstrate the quantitative power of a particular direction. But you got to know what those things are going into it so that you use the right mechanism for gathering the feedback.
I think this leads nicely into our next point, which is how do you take this input and make it actionable, right? So how do you take all of this input and filter it down or synthesize it into actions in a way that, first of all, is actually helpful in the project that you're trying to do, and also actually like makes the people who've taken their time to give you input feel like it was a worthwhile exercise. So I've seen this work best when there is a small team or committee that is in charge of facilitating this process that then has essentially voting or decision-making power to synthesize this information and make choices based on that information. I'm not honestly a huge fan of, especially when it comes to the kind of work that we're doing, brand building, marketing work, website overhauls, of just taking community input and just doing whatever gets the most number of votes, right? If we're putting logo concept A versus logo concept B, or if we're asking people to help give us input around like how we might label the navigation on our website. To me, this is just data. And it's not necessarily going to be something that I take at face value and just say, well, got the most votes. That's what we're going with, I guess. So like, how do you think about interpreting the results of this community input?
Yeah, again, I think the logo example is a great test case here for this conversation. So you put two logos in front of your audience and collecting feedback. If you ask, which do you like better? And that's all your audience understands about the contribution that they're making, then the implicit expectation is that you're going to choose the one that got the most votes. When really what you might just be after is like, I want to get a gut read on like, are we totally off on one or the other of these? In which case you're asking the wrong question and you're putting it in front of your collaborators in the wrong way.
Right.
A better question might be putting both logos in front of people and saying, what do you like about this one and what do you dislike about this one?
Right.
What do you feel when you see this one versus what do you feel when you see that one? And getting that sort of directional feedback, you're making no promises, implicit or explicit, about what a vote might mean, and you're collecting the right kind of information to make the decision.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this goes back to our point around how do you design the input process to be as effective as possible? And yeah, exactly. Like what question do you even ask? How do you ask that question? That's going to have a huge implication on the kind of answers that you get. Are you providing context for people that you're getting feedback from? Because if you just put two random pictures in front of someone and ask them which one they like better, like what is that really giving you at the end of the day? But if you instead present two different design directions, to just kind of like use this example and articulate, here are our goals, here's what we're trying to achieve, here are the outcomes that we're looking for. Of these two concepts, which concept do you feel like resonates with that strategy more? That's so much more impactful as data and input. That's so much easier for the community members to actually weigh in on strategically and not just get into this kind of like aesthetic gut level reaction. So much of this comes down to design. When should you get community input? And when should you not get community input? What's just your like gut level reaction to that question?
There's no one size fits all response to that, but I think we can agree that landing on either end of this spectrum for all of your decision making is a fool's errand. You can't be 100% collaborative all the time, and you can't be 100% closed door all the time. You know, I think there's actually been a trend in our space to attempting to collect more community input. I think that's generally a good thing. We sometimes do more damage than good when we attempt these collaborations that are not well thought out. I would think of them as like performative collaboration.
Right.
It's almost the same idea as like a virtue signal, right? Like we care about collaboration, we care about inclusivity, and we want to hear your voice. but actually what you have to say means nothing for our decision making, and we're going to do what we want anyway.
Not that voice.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that actually can damage trust with your community if you are seeking input and not being really clear about how that input's being used to make decisions or not.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of a story of a rebrand project that we did where we talked about this kind of upfront, like, hey, how much community input do we feel like is fruitful for this project? How much input do you already have from your community that we might be able to use to influence this? This is something we talk about a lot with clients because there is, again, no one-size-fits-all approach to this. And we collectively landed on, you know what, we don't need to do a lot of community input on this project for all these different reasons. We got, halfway through the project, we were all internally, our team and the client team, feeling really good about things. But it became pretty clear pretty quickly that we had collectively missed the mark in a pretty big way with one of our logo concepts, in a way that kind of unintentionally would have excluded a portion of their community, in a way that would have been, like, frankly, almost kind of embarrassing. And we quickly kind of course corrected and realized, okay, like, pause. We need to do like a full community input process here. We need to get input both from like the end, a bunch of different stakeholders in the community, as well as kind of like the governance board to be able to do this well. And it really got me thinking about this very question and like, how do we make sure not to do that again? And how do we know when it's time to involve the community and at what level? One of the takeaways I personally had from that is that the more your community feels ownership over your brand, like they are part of your brand, they belong, it's part of their identity, the more I think community input becomes super important.
I think having your community bought into the brand and what you stand for and what it means for their own personal identities is a superpower for social impact work in this sector, if you can find that. I also don't think that you're going to garner all of that trust and relationship through a singular community collaboration effort, right? Certainly that can be a positive piece of the puzzle, but it's certainly not going to be everything. I do think actually you probably are looking at doing more damage if you do it incorrectly than the positive upside of doing it correctly in most cases, which is why I think it's very important to have this well thought out and mapped out for any big community collaboration before you begin the project.
Yeah. And I'm just going to like a moment of honesty and vulnerability. This used to scare me a lot early on. And for really just kind of practical reasons, like getting community input, especially when we're not always able to design and facilitate that community input, it can really slow a project down, right? And it can be, if it's not designed well, almost more harm than good. But what I've learned over the years is that doing this well can be so critical and so important that it's one of the first questions that I'm thinking anytime we're bringing a new client on and thinking about a rebrand or any big project that's going to have a meaningful impact on their community is when and how much community input should we be building into our design process for this? So let's talk about one other, I think, kind of top of mind question our listeners probably have, which is, what do you do if you get bad community input? And what I mean by bad is, let's assume you've done all of your work to get good quality community input. You've designed the input process effectively. You've been clear about expectations with the people who are giving you input. You have a team to facilitate this and to interpret the results and to make decisions. But the feedback that you're getting from your community is counter to what you had hoped you were getting. Either that it pointed you in a different direction, or it's just generally the reception has been negative to your plan or any work that's done to this point. How have you managed navigating that negative feedback and the balance between there will always be some amount of negative feedback? What's the ratio of good to bad feedback that you're looking for when you're getting community input?
Gosh, honestly, I've made decisions on both ends of the spectrum, and for better or for worse, where there have been times where I've made the decision to just plow ahead with what I believe, even though the feedback I'm getting may counter that. There are other times where I start to evaluate my own thinking and say, like, gosh, I was way off on this.
Yeah.
And my community is giving me a signal that I've made a mistake somewhere. Now, I think a lot of that comes down to this question of, have I included my community in a way that gives them a chance to express something that they are seeing that I cannot see?
Right.
I think that's a really important sort of strategic screen to making these decisions around who to include on decision making and when. And for me, a lot of times it comes down to, I can't see everything. By the nature of my job, there's a limited amount of information I can collect with my own eyes. Who is seeing the dynamic or the thing most closely? Who can influence what's happening, a behavior or some sort of dynamic? Who can influence that most powerfully? And I want to include those people in the community collaboration effort because they're seeing something I can't see. And that's ultimately going to be the kind of the thing I'm going to be listening to when I confront this conundrum of, I'm hearing some feedback that is counter to what I was expecting here. And do those people see something that I can't see? Or am I seeing the same thing that they're seeing and we just disagree?
Like, that's really, at the end of the day, that's the purpose of community input, right? Like, you're going to get a new set of perspectives and experiences than you would otherwise. And that can be helpful. I guess, like, one thing that we should mention is that sometimes you will get a vocal, passionate minority that really disagrees, but they're small, versus a large population that either agrees or is neutral. And so, like, how do you know when it's time to just say, you know what? We don't care about those people, which sounds really brutal, or we do care about those people, but we're going to continue on this path anyway because most people are on board with this. Is this just like a gut thing? Is there some kind of threshold? Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I'm actually dealing with this situation at this exact moment. There's a big project that I'm working on through my organization, and there's a subset of people who feel very passionately about this, the direction we take on this project. It's a small group of people who have very strong and very valid reasons for believing what they believe. And that caused me a lot of stress and consternation because what I eventually learned for myself is this project, the direction we're taking, is ultimately not for them. And so having a clear understanding of who my audience is, the impact we're having, and who we're serving, and what our unique approach to the problem is, helped me clarify for myself, you know what? The path forward is not to serve this group, but what I do need to do is I need to pay attention to the underlying reasons that they are so vocal and so emotional about this. And is there a way for me to address that emotion and address that big feeling as a part of my overall ultimate decision that will help them feel seen and acknowledged? And I do think we've found that, but it took me that moment of realizing I'm not doing this for them.
Yeah. So in hindsight, would you include them again if you had it to do over, even though it wasn't for them, just because that opinion is still a valid opinion?
I would, because ultimately they've raised something that ultimately honors a legacy and honors the history of this project. And I think that ultimately is a really important thing to do that I wasn't tracking at the beginning. So
even though they're not going to get their way, so to speak, it's still been a valuable exercise for you in navigating the overall kind of challenges and opportunities with this project.
Absolutely.
So I think one more thing to say on this, and then I want to give you some time to just, add anything that you feel like you still would like to cover. I think we need to be aware of this kind of negativity bias. And what I mean by that is that as human beings, we pay more attention to and give more credit to and are more affected by negativity than positivity. So even in situations where there is 80% support, maybe even vocal support, but 20% negative feedback, that 20% negative feedback is going to affect us and influence us way more just by nature of our psychology than the 80% support. So I think that's just something for our listeners to be aware of. Again, not to say you should ignore people, but you should just be aware of, like, are my emotions clouding my judgment because of this negativity bias?
Yeah, I think ultimately that what that comes down to is a sense of, for the leader or the person running the project, your own ability to recognize where your power is in this project and feel confident and assertive in that power and your authority to make decisions, but also humble enough to listen to the underlying reasons that you might be hearing these negative emotions to begin with, and ask yourself, is there a way for me to address those negative emotions, even though that's not going to be the thing that ultimately sways my decision?
Right. So any other big tips or takeaways from today you want to make sure listeners hear?
I think being thoughtful and not being impulsive about collecting community input is the single most important thing that a listener can try to factor into their own work. I think getting into those reactionary, impulsive community collaborations can do a lot of harm. And when thought out and planned out and mapped out ahead of time, can absolutely give you a unique advantage in the project that you're embarking on. So just take the time to plan these out.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that maybe we should leave listeners with is, at least in my experience, I've seen this work pretty much on every point along this spectrum. I've seen organizations that are co-creating everything, that are extremely democratic in their work, and that can work really well if that culture works for that organization. And certain types of organizations that's going to work better for than others. I've also seen examples of really solid, strong, determined, thoughtful leaders who don't get a lot of community input around how they make decisions. They maybe do it more intuitively, and that can work well. So you're going to kind of just have to find your way. But I do think it's a worthwhile thing to explore. How and when and why do I include my community in my decision making? And if we're going to do that, how do we do that more skillfully and make sure it's not derailing our projects?
I can't wait to hear listeners' questions and comments about this conversation today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Thank you, Eric.
If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. It really helps. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do for your cause and for being part of the movement to move humanity and the planet forward.